Hello there, you're watching the press preview, our first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. Over the next half an hour, we're going to be talking through the headlines with the director of the Demos think tank, Polly Mackenzie, and the journalist and chair of the Bright Blue think tank, Sarah Sands. So a very good evening to both of you.
Hi there.
So let's take a look then on what's making the front pages. And the Eye leads with NHS staff insisting they'll strike if the government doesn't increase its offer of a 1% pay rise. The Mirror describes the proposal as Boris's slap for carers. Likewise, The Star appears to suggest the Prime Minister's applause last year was a hollow gesture. Indeed, The Guardian understands there will be a slow hand clap next Thursday by way of a protest. And that row over NHS pay is also the big story for The Express. The Daily Telegraph reports that from Monday, people attempting to travel out of Britain and onto the continent will need to produce forms to prove their journey is essential. The Times has spoken to the head of an influential scientific group who believes the presence of new COVID-19 variants in the UK will not hinder a return to normality. The Financial Times has seen data which shows a substantial drop in trade between France and the UK at the start of the year, which the paper says is largely down to Brexit. And the Daily Mail has a story regarding the controversy over who is paying for planned renovations to the flat above number 10 Downing Street. So Polly Mackenzie and Sarah Sands here with me to go through some of those front pages. And Polly, you've picked out the Eye first of all, but there are a lot of similar headlines around in the morning, aren't they? Focusing in on the government's offer of a 1% pay rise to NHS staff, which has been met with a pretty angry reaction from unions.
Yeah, it's interesting to see so many of the papers lining up to criticise the government on this. And, you know, there's actually some strong arguments for a minimal pay rise. The private sector has had, massive impact on pay during this period. And so the government's making the case that public sector pay overall should be frozen. And they're making an exception. They think they're being very generous to the NHS by giving it 1% when everybody else is getting nothing. Actually, inflation is still pretty low, though in the budget, the Chancellor forecasted some inflationary pressures. So that might change. Nevertheless, it's not it's not wildly out of step with inflation. And of course, lots of people in the NHS get pay increments every year. So their pay goes up more and it averages out about 2.7%, not 1%, once you've added in those increments. Nevertheless, it doesn't look good. And you can see the papers ganging up. They see political weakness. The nurses, it's always the lightning rod is nurses, even though actually they're not the worst paid in the NHS. The worst paid will be cleaning porters and nursing assistants. The doctors don't get quite so much sympathy because they have a different pay band. But nevertheless, it will be about the nurses. The nurses are threatening to go on strike. And I forecast that in the end, this government, which caves on everything, will cave.
That's interesting. I'll pick up on that straight away, actually, with you, Sarah Sands. Do you think this could be another Marcus Rashford moment, as some people are suggesting?
It's looking like it, isn't it? I mean, they started with a sort of economic argument, firstly, the country's bust, and second, as Polly said, that in the private sector, a lot of jobs have gone, so that trying to make people think that at least these are secure jobs and that actually there will be more jobs, as we know, in health. But it's just not working. You just don't take on nurses. And I wonder if they're just looking for some way out. I mean, it did occur to me that you could make the equivalent with what happens during wartime, actually, is that soldiers can get sort of special combat pay. And this has been a kind of war and nurses have been on the front line. So I wonder if they could come up with some sort of special payment, but they're certainly going to have to come up with something.
Well, yes, and to pick up on another paper that's covering the story in a similar way, The Guardian, nurses threaten strike as Hancock defends pay offer. But we have, of course, heard Matt Hancock, haven't we, Polly, several times talking about the need to reward NHS staff. In fact, on Sky Sophie Ridge on Sunday, he said last July, we absolutely want to reward NHS staff for what they've done. So what are the political implications for getting into some kind of a battle with NHS staff who have been widely praised by cabinet members and the Prime Minister themselves for the work they've done?
I think it's potentially politically risky. Nurses are, everybody loves nurses, everybody loves the NHS. We clap for carers, we put rainbows in our windows. It is the national religion, basically. And picking a fight is dangerous. But also there's a kind of pragmatic case that actually if nurses do go on strike, that inevitably, though they will continue always to support emergency care, it does have an impact, creates a backlog for elective care, things like hip operations or diagnosis, scans and tests. And we've already got the motherload of backlogs as a result of this year of COVID and so much of the NHS having to be restricted or shut down. So we know that the Tories are always vulnerable on the NHS. It's, people trust them on the economy, but not so much on public services. If the NHS gets into a really, really difficult situation, that's a huge political vulnerability for them. A strike would just worsen all of the problems which the NHS is already facing.
And Sarah, it's just a days away from the budget, of course. Do you think there will be some public sympathy for the government line that says, remember the budget? We heard how bad the economy, the state that it's in, just a couple of days ago. We saw that it had record levels of debt, that there's a tax burden that we haven't seen since the 1960s. We can only pay what we can afford. And this is about retaining jobs as well.
Well, seemingly not. That if you look at the public opinion polls, people want nurses to be paid considerably more, and certainly on this seem to be entirely sort of sympathetic. So I think the trouble with big spending is that people start to get used to it and make comparisons. Think so much already. Why not just bung in a bit more, to people who deserve it? So I think to have to sort of retrain people out of the current sort of Keynesian economics is going to take a little time.
Well, yes, and Polly, this is the offer that the government is putting forward. It now goes to an independent panel that will decide what they think that the pay rise should be. And what about this issue of staffing? Because although I think the pandemic has prompted more people to come forward to say that they want to be nurses, there is a big shortfall. There's a number of vacancies, aren't there, across the board. Do you think that could be taken into consideration when pay is considered, how attractive it makes the job?
I think it has to be. There's two cases for paying nurses, but NHS staff more broadly more. The first is a natural justice one. And, we've seen in Scotland, the Scottish government has made a kind of a one-off payment, a bonus, a gratitude bonus. And there's people advocating in England that we should do the same. The other argument is a simply pragmatic one about demand and supply in the labour market. How do you get people to do these jobs? We had huge numbers of vacancies in the run-up to the pandemic. A lot of foreign-born people have, it seems from the data, gone home during this pandemic. Home's a loaded word, but they've gone back to another country. And they may or may not come back. We may have lost up to 1 million people from our population. So the pressure to recruit people into the NHS when people are, so many will feel burnt out and exhausted by this experience, we may find that we have to put wages up in order to recruit and retain the volumes of nurses and doctors and care workers that we need in the system. Of course, the really vulnerable group is care workers in the social care system. We're not really talking about them. They don't have that hero status of the NHS. They're mostly in the private sector. They're often on the minimum wage. They're often on not even full employment contracts. And actually, if the government was to do something there, I think it would have much more of an impact, certainly on the quality of the system, regardless of exactly where the politics lie.
And Sarah, finally, let's look at a couple of front pages which treat the story in a similar kind of way, I would say. I don't know what you think. Daily Mirror calls it Boris's slap for carers, of course, a reference to clap for carers, and the Daily Star as well. I mean, it's rather a long quotation they've got on the front there, or rather a long headline. They say, I'm not giving them a decent pay rise, but do you think they'd settle for another clap? Suggesting that's what the Prime Minister is saying. What will Downing Street make of that kind of coverage? I mean, presumably they've been cheered by the fact that the polls suggest that the Tories are doing a bit better because of the success of the vaccination programme. Will they be worried about headlines like this?
I'm sure they will. I think the Express as well has taken them on, which you wouldn't necessarily expect. So I think you're right. They've had a big bounce, and there seem to be slightly a Teflon effect at the moment, that they have been doing pretty well. So I think they won't like this at all.
No, indeed. Well, we're going to take a break right there, but plenty more to be discussed in just a moment after the break, where we're going to be talking more about the pandemic, but also the glimmer of hope for a return to normality. More on that coming up after the break.
I'm Adam Parsons. I'm Sky's Europe correspondent based here in Brussels. More flares going off, a volley of rocks, cobbles have been pulled up out and are being used as missiles to hurl at these police. We take you to the heart of stories that shape our world. We aim to be the best and most trusted place for news. We have now left Italy and entered France. Nobody's asked to check our identity. Made by people who dare to challenge. Nice to see you again, Mr. Barnier. Why?
Meeting you.
Fishing does have the potential to stymie an enormous economic deal. What strikes you when you come to this glacier is not just the way in which the environment is changing, but the speed at which those changes are happening.
It's devastating, actually.
Welcome back. You're watching the press preview with me tonight, Polly Mackenzie and Sarah Sands. So welcome back to both of you. Sarah, we're kicking off this section with the Daily Telegraph. Their headline says travel permits to stop Easter holidays abroad. And a lot of people are starting to dream about some kind of holiday. So what's the Telegraph talking about? What is potentially changing?
Well, this is oddly punitive, a little bit police state, that you have to prove that you're on legitimate business if you go away, and the fines are going to go up. And I think so at the same time that vaccines are working and the cases of COVID are going down, there seems to be sort of unease that there might be a dividend, or that people might start to loosen up a little bit, that those over 70s might just start creeping abroad. There was that story this morning about Cyprus welcoming people who are vaccinated from May. So this is the government sort of toughening up and cracking down. And I think you just have to watch that social contract a bit, that Graham Brady is already sort of complaining that, hang on, this is a time where you would think restrictions are being lifted, things are getting better, cases going down, vaccines are working. So you toughen up restrictions. And on the other side, there's for that exact reason that if domestically things are getting better, that's when you close your borders.
It is interesting, the psychology of it, Polly, isn't it? Because on the one hand, people need to feel optimistic, but the government is clearly worried that when they do start talking about better times ahead, everyone's just going to relax, especially, it would appear, those who've been vaccinated who thinks, surely it's OK that I can behave a little bit in a more relaxed way.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the article says that they're particularly worried about people who've been vaccinated meeting up with family and friends, jetting off on holiday, whatever it might be, assuming they can get past the border guards. And, it's an odd situation that we've got to, that it's only now, just as we are hopefully on the exit ramp, that they're bothering to enforce the laws that they impose. We had a quarantine last summer, I remember, where, I was coming back from France, went through the border guards. Nobody told me I had to quarantine, even though I knew from the news that I had to. Nobody gave any instructions, nobody called, and so they allowed us to have rules that were most honoured in the breach than the what's the word? You know what I mean, anyway. For ages, and now right at the last minute, they finally learned that it's better to have a small set of rules and enforce them. But I don't think this will last. I think it's getting harder and harder to sustain public consent for having to follow rules, especially when you see, people in care homes where the elderly person has been vaccinated and their visitor's been vaccinated, and they're still having to hide behind perspex screens. It just feels a bit wrong-headed.
Well, and obviously the hope is that the restrictions, or tight restrictions, certainly won't be in place for too much longer, Sarah. And the Times kind of feeds that sense of optimism, doesn't it? Their headline says, variants will not hold UK back, says top scientist, because the one outlier appears to be, this sense of possible new variants potentially evading vaccines in the future. So what's the Times reporting here?
Yeah, that is really good news, that the vaccine should work on these variants and that the variants aren't taking over. And I guess the point of that was the fear that we would start to come out of lockdown and then some variant would scupper it all. And it looks as if it's under control, and that in the same way that flu, the family of flu sort of worked with variants, that this can happen in the same way. So that's a sort of scientific confidence which should please everyone. But it makes me wonder if that June date is still too cautious, and that they may be able to bring it forward a bit. I see Boris Johnson's going off to India next month. I think it's reported somewhere. So if he can travel,
that's not a holiday though, is it? I don't know. Why is he going?
No, that's essential business. Essential business.
Well, he's got to fill out the form, I guess.
People are going to start to sort of work things out for themselves, as Polly said, on those people who have been vaccinated, where it is already breaking down, and older people are seeing each other, and it's because you can't really give a sort of rational explanation why they shouldn't. If they're not transmitting it and they're protected, why can't they see each other? Except that because we're all in this together. And I guess that is another point, that if younger people who have been denied their festivals and so on see a lot of older people sort of having their own over 70s raves, they're going to get quite cross.
Yeah. OK, well, we're out of time there, but Polly and Sarah, really good to see you both, and I'm pleased to say you'll be back at 11:30. For now, thank you.
Even.
Well, before we go, if you've missed any of the press previews tonight, or the one that we've just done, it's going to be available shortly and every night on our YouTube channel.